Do the ends justify the means? This is a question that, when asked, will likely receive different answers nearly every single time. The idea of actions being justified if they endeavor to achieve what is ultimately a noble pursuit has existed since the dawn of civilization. However, today I want to examine the complexity behind this idea and argue, if possible, that the concept has become so twisted it now represents a fundamentally damaging philosophy which becomes increasingly severe when exacerbated by modern political unrest. When asking this question, there is a spectrum. On one end are relatively harmless pursuits that require something entirely trivial to achieve. A college student who recently graduated might lie on their resume to land a job that had unrealistic requirements to begin with. This can be considered immoral, it can be considered unethical, but the justification is that the employer had constructed an unfair system. So a lie within that unfair system to achieve a favorable outcome is therefore acceptable. This is an extremely innocuous example until you dig deeper. The idea that employment standards are ill-constructed might be true. The idea that you should be able to qualify for a job could be accurate, but the decision to circumvent the framework in place in order to achieve that goal immediately affects an untold number of people. The problem is, these effects are not easily visible, and more often than not, entirely impossible to prove. By falsifying your resume to gain employment at a job you believe you deserve, you might have just replaced someone who truly needs that job. This person might be in dire circumstances, and the resulting lack of employment, which they otherwise would have received without your lie, could become the first of a series of dominoes that result in tragedy, well and truly beyond any benefit that the lies initially awarded. The problem stems from the issue of what is known versus what is unknown. A person can know that their lack of employment or higher ability is becoming an issue, but they cannot know what effect a lie will have on the person that they have replaced. The ends, in this case, are a student finding a job. The means are manipulating their resume, and the results will never see the light of day because connections between cause and effect are never even explored. This, however, is a very simple example. On the other end of the spectrum are severe and massively impactful events, such as a global pandemic and the ensuing lockdown, or the decision to gather personal data on US citizens to prevent future crimes. These are examples of ends justifying means on the largest possible scale because if we reduce these events down to their very core premise, it is the decision to shut down economic functions, something that has demonstrably negative results in a myriad of different categories, in order to save lives, or breaching the privacy of hundreds of millions of people to catch the few that will conspire to commit acts of evil. The current global pandemic and the previous lengthy lockdown are a perfect example. On the one hand, speculative human life based on projections, healthcare system estimates, and disease data, while on the other, economic functions that support the livelihood of millions. The most rudimentary analysis possible is that life supersedes property and money. This is something that on a small scale would be very difficult to dispute. One life is, according to social consensus, more important than a car, for example. But what happens when you expand this comparison to a national, even global scale? The tone of discussion one might see on social media, for example, tends to be slanted heavily towards the end goal justifying the means. It is desirable to avoid death. That position is practically impenetrable from a moral perspective. And the calls to shut it all down, because if we don't, people will die, on a surface level seems very hard to dispute. However, what if I told you that the resulting lockdowns had caused a 1,000% spike in suicide prevention hotline calls? What if I said that documented child abuse calls had fallen, but their severity had increased exponentially? What if estimates emerged that indicated tens of thousands of cancer cases had either gone undiagnosed or untreated because routine hospital visits and checkups had ground to a halt under the shelter-in-place orders? This makes no mention of opioid usage and the rise in fatal overdoses, the uptick in addiction by new users, and the horrible long-term effects this can have on families involved. The idea that a lockdown saves lives is not so black and white. The end goal, being the mitigation of tragedy in the face of a deadly new disease, is not simply being weighed against property and employment, it is being weighed against innumerable factors that can directly and indirectly result in harm. Do the ends still justify the means? That question should be increasingly difficult to answer. There is no doubt that this new virus is extremely transmissible. The rapid spread and the dangers of that being allowed to happen are very real. But weighing the prevention methods on a broken scale, under the diluted justification that the ends will obviously justify the means at whatever cost, while deliberately ignoring what the means even are, is a dangerous position. The state of the world, and particularly America right now, is chaotic. The sheer number of widespread ends justify means applications is staggering. Take the recent riots, for example. The ending goal, though it has taken on a somewhat nebulous atmosphere as of late, is police reform. But the means to get there have involved widespread crime. Similar to the global pandemic, we see an extremely binary claim. Life is more important than property, and in the short term, on a small scale, this is absolutely true. However, when you expand this claim outward and breach the barrier from personal property to corporate property, there is far less clarity. The impulsive reaction might be to claim that insurance exists and companies will be compensated for burned businesses. But this is not always true. The complexity of the insurance industry ensures that if they can find a way not to pay you, they surely will. And many small businesses do not have protection that allows for riot claims. However, looking past that initial deflection, the reality is that a store, restaurant, auto repair garage, housing complex, or any of the hundreds of destroyed buildings, these businesses provide employment and literal services. When they are destroyed, the rebuilding process, if they come back at all, which is a different topic, will take time. The hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of people who used to work there simply cannot anymore, and the community sees a decline in cash flow that will cripple all aspects of its commerce and life for years, possibly decades. This is merely one simple aspect. When discussing the riots and protests of 2020 America, we must also remember that dozens of people lost their lives, thousands were injured, and the widespread damage impacted millions more. None of this is to say that it was not justified. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But the simple idea of ends justifying means is infinitely complex and cannot be cited as a true defensible justification for current actions. A plausible explanation for the repeated desire of human beings to increasingly rely on immediate harmful action with subsequent escalation under a future goal to justify any damage done is the sunk cost fallacy. This is a behavioral trait of human beings where they will continue to push or endeavor in a pursuit simply as a function of how much time, resources, money, or energy they have already invested. Once a person has made the decision to pursue a specific goal or reward, they will continue that pursuit far in excess of the actual cost-to-benefit ratio. As an example, if you buy tickets to a movie, but the roads are icy and dangerous, you might still go and risk the drive because your ticket would otherwise be worthless. In reality, simply letting the ticket go to waste and then buying a new one for another day entirely might be much, much safer and cost-effective. But since you do not want to lose what you had already invested, the decision becomes warped. On the drive, you might damage your car, resulting in hundreds of dollars in repairs, and ultimately your endeavor to protect your first investment cost you far more than it could have ever been worth. The same can also be true when considering our propensity to justify means in pursuit of the ending goal. If the student already spent a great deal of time going through the job application process and has a high degree of emotional investment, they might be more likely to lie on their resume and increase their own chances. The idea of increasing what we are willing to tolerate in terms of short-term pain, losses, or damage can increase just the same way our susceptibility to risk will grow in the face of an initial investment. If you invested a great deal of time into the application process and care tremendously about the results, you might even justify committing a small crime to make sure you get the job. That crime could result in your termination, financial damage, and much more, which in reality far outweighs the benefit on the ending horizon, but many people will still do it just the same. The ends may very well justify the means, or they may not. It is an issue to be judged in real time. However, since the emotional and psychological investment only grows, it becomes increasingly difficult to critically evaluate whether or not the current means are going too far and have eclipsed the ending goal. The truth is that all too often, secondary factors are not even explored. The ending goal is projected as ultimately important, and the infinite number of damaging side effects along the way are simply ignored. While the ending goal remains somewhat rigid in most cases, the cost to achieve it rises constantly. And right alongside that rising cost is our willingness to pay it. Somehow, some way, in today's emotionally charged environment, the simple analysis of what ends can be justified by what means will often be seen as offensive. In a calculation that requires real-time considerations and adjustments, a firm stance of whatever the cost, we must be willing to pay it, is all too often assigned and then adhered to by the masses. This impulsive action can sometimes be justified, but critically examining whether it is or is not on a much more frequent basis is something that all of us should be willing to do. Do the ends justify the means? If the end is a goal and the means are the journey, and we as humans are a product of our own actions, when a point is reached where the actions taken to reach a goal exceed the value of that goal itself, the effort must be terminated. Knowing when that point comes is no easy task, but at the very least, we should avoid attacking and shutting down those who merely pose the question. Instead of allowing ourselves to get wrapped up in the cycle of more anger, more fear, and more action, which in turn leads to a higher threshold of what we are willing to do, invest, or destroy, all of us need to distance ourselves from the entire philosophy that the ends will justify the means. If we reach the end goal before the means escalate to a critical point, that is success. But if we do not, shutting down the end goal and ceasing the means which we currently employ in favor of reform or better thought out process, that must be something we are able and willing to do, because failure in that regard is self-harm, even if we have convinced ourselves it is worth it. That's it for today. If you want to support, there are links down below. I am testing out a new animation partnership, so let me know feedback on that in the comment section. If this is something that goes well, I am considering a second channel for topics like these with this animation framework, but I don't want to pull the trigger on it until I'm completely sure. Links down below to support, merch, Patreon, Twitter, other social media, another YouTuber to support as well, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.